I'm Ksenia and welcome to another Guiding Star Astrology question. And I am looking today at a question that I get asked very frequently by a lot of people. So this is not just an answer to just one person's question. This is an answer to questions and statements and comments that I see constantly popping up in threads online, not just on my YouTube channel, but on every astrology YouTube channel out there. Help me, I have Saturn retrograde in my chart is the usual statement. Or what does it mean to have Saturn retrograde in my chart? So today we're going to have a look at, just briefly, Saturn retrograde in the chart. I am hoping to do a series on Saturn and Saturn's movement through each house very shortly before the end of the year, and in that I will be addressing retrogression. But I thought I'd just give a brief overview now to help answer this question that's on so many people's hearts and minds. Simply, it's come up so frequently lately, especially because Saturn has very recently turned retrograde. So I thought it's a really, really good opportunity to explore this topic. So just for the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to wander through what it means to have Saturn retrograding in your chart. Well, retro planets, they're actually at their closest point to the Earth. This is every retrograde planet. They're at their closest point to the Earth, so their energy is a lot stronger. And I'll use this as an example. Let's just put, here is Saturn. Let's say the sun's down here in the sign of Cancer. And as you can see, here is Saturn up here, retrograde at the moment. And the Earth has moved, well, just recently it's sort of around here in Taurus, but it's down here in the signs opposite Saturn. And so essentially when we look at the wheel chart, we consider this point, the central point, to be our vantage point, Earth. So at this time, Saturn is closer to the Earth than it is to the Sun when it's in Cancer. But also, Saturn's just gone retrograde. I should have just left this here. Saturn's gone retrograde, and here is the Sun in Taurus. So Saturn currently is closer to the Earth than it is to the Sun, and that will remain retrograde until roughly the Sun gets around here, and then Saturn will go direct. Because the a retrograde planet is always closer to the Earth than it is to the Sun. And that's what makes a planet retrograde. It looks to us in the sky from where we sit like this planet's going backwards. But really what's happening is that the planet is at its closest point to the Earth than it is to the Sun, and therefore the energy is strongest. We receive it fully without being filtered down or, watered down by the Sun's powerful dynamic stellar energy. Okay? So it's unadulterated by the Sun. The energy of the planet that is retrograde is unadulterated by the Sun. So retro planets, like I said, they're usually found generally opposite the Sun, and in many cases, when the Sun is currently in Taurus, as it is, and Saturn's just gone retrograde, it's trine. So essentially, from a trinal position to the Sun, we could almost say, you'll go retrograde if you're a big outer planet like Saturn, Neptune, Jupiter, Pluto also, and Uranus. So from here around to here, this is when you'll find that when the Sun is trining a planet such as Saturn, right round a Sun's journey, right round to here, to Virgo, when it will trine again, Saturn, that will be the planet's retrograde period. This is the outer planets, Saturn's retrograde period. So we'll just look at that because this is an answer to a question about Saturn. We won't go into the inner planets. Now, retrograde planets in a chart, they indicate the internalizing of the planet's energies. So instead of expressing, say, the energies of Saturn, which would be maturity, responsibility, hard work, duty, fulfilling our obligations, instead of expressing those out to the world, from us out to the world, we internalize them. And I'll explain how that plays out just shortly. With retrograde planets, we actually have a need to make changes on an internal level before we can express these energies outwardly. So the change needs to happen internally first, so we can integrate the energies and be able to manifest them at an external level. People with direct planets, say direct Saturn in their chart, are going to manage to be able to display maturity and responsibility in wherever the Saturn falls in their house a lot easier than people with retrograde planets, because they've got to deal with some internal stuff first and master the ability to be mature, master the ability to be responsible, master the ability to work hard in whatever realm of life their Saturn falls, before they can then before they're enabled to then express that energy outwardly in and around them in their lives. So Saturn, he has rules, he has regulations, his limitations, his responsibility, his discipline, to name a few things. He rules a lot of stuff. So retrograde Saturn can then express in any of the following ways. There can be a difficulty for people with retrograde Saturn to say no to others, to put up a boundary. Usually, like Saturn, when he is direct, he brings boundaries easily into our lives. Yep, no, I'm not going there. That's not going to happen. When you've got retrograde Saturn, it's harder to have a boundary in place and to say no. Retrograde Saturn can also manifest. It doesn't have to manifest in all these ways. Just one is enough. You know, you might notice in your life, if you've got retrograde Saturn, you might struggle with boundaries in life, like I just described. And this can actually be made worse if you happen to have a really strong Neptune as well, strong Pisces, or a strong 12th house. Because these energies, Neptune, Pisces, and the 12th house, are generally struggling with boundary issues anyway, and if Saturn is retrograde, it just adds fuel to that fire of difficulty saying no and saying, you know, I'm not going to overgive, I'm not going to be a martyr to you. It's harder when Saturn is retrograde and you've got a strong Neptune or Pisces or 12th house. These would be strong if, like, they were in your ascendant, or Pisces was rising, or you had lots of planets in the 12th house, these sorts of things. So there can be struggles again with boundaries, both for yourself and putting boundaries around other people in your life with a retrograde Saturn, if that's the case. You can also be a bit, if you've got retrograde Saturn, a bit unrealistic about limits. For example, I have a friend who's got retrograde Saturn, an incredible person, lots of talent, lots of ability, lots of capacity to do incredible stuff in the world, but she keeps herself small. She keeps herself limited, and she doesn't permit herself to spread out in the world like she could, to rise up and do incredible things. She is a big fish in a very small pond because she doesn't have realistic ideas about limitations. She thinks she's limited to this small pond that she functions in, when really she's got the capacity, one of the very few blessed people that has the capacity to really go big. She just doesn't have a realistic grasp of what the true limitations and capacities are in her life. So she's afraid to expand herself into the world. The opposite can also be true with a retrograde Saturn, where we can actually think too big. You know, we think there are no limits. We overextend ourselves, and maybe we don't have the skills to be that high flyer, but we think we do. Saturn can manifest in either way, holding ourselves back when we actually are really capable, or you know, putting ourselves forward and out there when we really are out of our depth, you know. It can also manifest in anxiety about responsibility, because Saturn is responsibility, and if we're internalizing that rather than expressing it, we get anxious about having to be in a situation where we've got to be responsible and dutiful, and we've got to express responsibly. People with Saturn retrograde, they need to practice these Saturn qualities. Like, you need to practice being responsible. You need to practice being hardworking. You need to practice being dutiful. You need to practice showing up in the world. You know, you need to practice Saturn qualities in your own personal life. Perhaps it doesn't have to be out there in the world. You know, maybe you need to practice being responsible for your kids instead of letting your partner always take the duty and do the responsibility. Maybe you need to step up and start doing the dishes every night and cooking dinner and being a bit more domestically responsible. You need to master that before then you can get out in the world and start setting appropriate boundaries, being responsible and carrying greater responsibility in the world once you've learned to master it in your private life. There's also, with Saturn retrograde, a need to overcome the internal anxiousness that you will feel about these things, such as my friend who is a big fish in a small pond. She's just too anxious to put herself out there into the public realm like she so very well could. And so she's got this internal anxiousness about doing so, and it's keeping her back. So she needs to overcome that. She needs to practice that. She needs to maybe do some courses in self-assertion or something, or self-expansion and growth and that sort of thing that would really help her to overcome this internal anxiousness. Once Saturn retrograde people have dealt with this and have overcome this internal anxiousness, they will see these things working better and better and better in their own lives at an external level. So if my friend did some self-actualization course or self-assertion course, that sort of thing, she may become more confident about, you know, going down to Melbourne and being very visible and being part of the bigger pond rather than the small pond, you know. So she would gain courage and confidence in that realm. Now, the influence of these retrograde challenges, they actually happen for a purpose. So don't think, oh, woe is me, you know, Saturn is retrograde and I'm screwed. No, they happen to help you grow. And we're all on a soul journey, essentially. We are all trying to evolve through life as an individual. It doesn't do us any good to compare ourselves with this person or that person, or, you know, that doesn't help ever. What we should be comparing ourselves to, if we had the knowledge to do so, is to our past life experiences, to what has gone on before, you know, but often we don't know what has gone on before. But if we could look at the big picture, and sometimes astrology can give us insights there, we would see how far we've come, and that really having Saturn retrograde is a response to past life experiences that we are now up-leveling from, that we are now maturing from and growing from. And that would give us a great deal of courage and hope and, you know, an understanding of our soul journey. Okay, so never compare yourself to other people, especially when you look at your chart and, oh, someone's got a better chart than me, or, you know, that's just not helpful. It's like comparing apples with bananas. They're just not the same. So you need to look at yourself and realize you're on a journey with your soul of mastery, of learning to manage energy, of heading up the evolutionary enlightenment ladder, and then just trust that this process and whatever is occurring in your chart is for your highest good, and know that you can work in really high and positive ways with the energies that are in your chart. So the influence of Saturn retrograde is actually to help you grow, and it's going to relate to the whole sign house in which Saturn falls. Now you're probably going to say, okay, well, my Saturn's in this house. What does that mean? So let's just briefly, and remember this is very, very briefly, we're going to go through what it means. So Saturn in the first house, when he's retrograde in the first house, Saturn will tend to assume the responsibilities of other people in order to feel wanted or connected. So it's getting its sense of self-worth and self-value. When you've got Saturn retrograde in the first, your sense of self, the first house is our sense of self, is coming from other people and their approval or whatever disapproval of us. In order to feel connected, we take on their responsibility. Let me do that for you. Let me show you how to do this. Let me help you with this. And it's like this need to assume responsibility for others, as well as like you know, taking care of other people, being responsible for other people, rather than yeah. So when retrograde, Saturn in this placement, it indicates people who will take responsibility for other people in order to feel wanted and connected, and also because they don't know when to say no. No, I can't take on that extra workload, and no, I can't. You know, someone with a direct Saturn would say, look, I've got too much on my plate. You cannot give me that extra project because I just do not have the capacity to do it. Saturn direct takes on those extra responsibilities that it shouldn't do, and then suffers for it because it wants to be connected. It wants to feel, and you know, that sense of being wanted and being needed, and it has no boundaries. So just be careful of that with Saturn retrograde in the first house. Saturn in the second house retrograde can indicate that you have this feeling of you know, if you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself, or you know, you must work hard for what you get in life. There's this internalization of that kind of attitude that's really not helpful. Some people don't have to work very hard, and they get a lot of great stuff just going their way. It's not a helpful mindset to think I have to bust a gut and whip myself in order to be successful in life, and that is what Saturn retrograde in the second house can have a tendency towards. So watch out for that one. There can be a tendency with Saturn retrograde in the second house to feel like you're financially responsible for everyone. Again, no boundaries. You keep, you know, forking out money left, right, and center to help other people with a desire to be approved of, to, you know, get some respect and what have you. But there's no appropriate boundaries in place, and you're just over giving unnecessarily, and people take advantage of you sometimes, and that can occur too. When you've got Saturn retrograde in the second house, that can be an issue. Saturn retrograde in the third house can give anxiety around learning, you know, feel like you don't know enough, feel like you can never accomplish enough, feel like you're not achieving enough in a learning situation. The third house is connected to learning. So there can be mistakes made with learning. There can be anxiousness about their assignments and their learning processes. You know, they become, you know, like easily distracted because they're so het up and anxious about learning and so forth. There can also be a problem with boundaries with siblings when you've got Saturn retrograde in the third house, where you don't know how to say no to your siblings. You don't know how to sort of set appropriate you know, boundaries about responsibility and about, you know, in the home as you're growing up, or even in older, you know, age. You know, your siblings keep coming around. I keep thinking, and not a sibling, but you know, one of the opening scenes of Back to the Future, when Biff keeps coming around and helping himself to beer out of George McFly's fridge and stuff like that. That's the kind of thing we could see between siblings occurring, where one sibling's just pushing and bullying his way into the environment of the Saturn retrograde person who has no boundaries and no capacity to say, no, back off, get out of here, Biff, and leave the beer with me, you know, that kind of scenario. When Saturn is retrograde natally in the fourth house, there can be a difficulty saying no to parents and having appropriate boundaries with parents. Like I've just described with the siblings, the same thing can apply with parents, where you just keep giving and giving and giving to your parents, and they're just like taking. You know, they're like, oh, this is a good thing. Yeah, my son or my daughter will take care of me, and they'll fork out their money for me, and they'll make room for me, and so on, which is in some cases a bit inappropriate. And you know, parents are a big drain on their children, which is not the way it should be. That's not always the case, obviously, but sometimes you see it happen, and it's often with someone with a Saturn retrograde in the fourth house, an indicator that the Saturn retrograde person has no capacity to put appropriate boundaries in place with parents. What is actually advised by a number of people who've researched this topic is that a person with Saturn retrograde in the fourth house needs to live at least 200 kilometers from their parents to establish their own identity from out underneath mum and dad's wing. So that's, if you've got this, you know, look at, you know, shifting and moving to somewhere where your identity is your own and where you do not bear the burden of responsibility for your parents. Saturn retrograde in the fifth house, there's a trouble saying no to children. There's a trouble putting boundaries in place with children. Some people, when they're parenting their children and they have Saturn retrograde in the fifth house, they feel like they've got to do it all themselves and that no one else will do it as good as they do. So they must carry all the burden and all the hardship of raising children on their own. It's not a nice placement, Saturn retrograde in the fifth house. It's hard work if you're a family-oriented person. If you've got Saturn retrograde in the fifth house, don't go gambling, because it's not going to work for you. You won't be able to manifest sort of big Tats Lotto wins or anything, so don't even bother trying there. You concentrate on safe investments instead when Saturn's retrograde in the fifth house. Watch out as well, Saturn retrograde in the fifth house can mean that your attempts to communicate love to someone else are misunderstood and that they kind of miss the mark perhaps a bit. Just be conscious that it doesn't mean you can't have love, it doesn't mean that you can't know romance in your life and that sort of thing, but there might be difficulties with lovers and putting boundaries in place with lovers, and a bit of a hit and miss kind of Cupid's arrow that doesn't quite, you know, accomplish what you hoped it would. Saturn retrograde people in the sixth house, they tend to be people who are perfectionists at work, And you know, this is the house of perfection, the 6th house. And so these people with Saturn retrograde here, they work to the nth degree, like too hard, because they don't know how to say no. They don't know how to have boundaries in place with regard to their daily work and their daily routines, and they push themselves too hard. They have trouble putting their foot down. They have trouble setting boundaries and saying no to bosses, and employees can also take advantage of them. Probably bosses more in the 10th house, but it's other co-workers can take advantage of them because they will just, you know, again, the whole George McFly scenario keeps popping up. He's a perfect Saturn retrograde type example where, you know, Biff and his gang keep dumping their homework on him. You know, you'll do my homework, and when we're employed as older people, you will do my assignments for me or my projects for me at work, because you don't know how to say no, so I'm going to take advantage of that. And that's one of the things that can happen. It's not an effective placement to have Saturn retrograde in the 6th house if you aspire to be a boss, to run the show. You know, it's going to be hard for you to do that. You're really going to have to work hard on working out and managing these boundary issues with Saturn before you can accomplish being somebody of you know, leadership. Saturn retrograde in the 7th can attract parenting issues in relationship. You can attract, you know, a partner where you've got to be responsible for finances, and you've got to be kind of baby them along. You've got to be the parent role because you don't know how to put boundaries in place with that person. You can't sort of, you know, they're looking to you to be their sugar daddy or their sugar mama or whatever, and you know, you have to take on the burden of the responsibility because you don't know how to say no. Well, you need to learn to say no. You know, I'm not going to be the sugar daddy. I'm not going to be the one who's out there working while you sit home and play Xbox games all day. That's a deal breaker. That's not on. You've got to put boundaries in place and respect yourself more. Saturn retrograde in the 7th house. Now, Saturn retrograde in the 8th house, I would encourage you, if you have this placement, to never combine resources with a partner. Never get a joint bank account. What you need to do is maintain your independence, because there is an inclination here to have no boundaries with regards to resources. Okay? So, you know, you hook up with someone, maybe you get married, and you open up a joint bank account when you've got Saturn retrograde in the 8th, and they just, you know, they just take all the money and spend it on their frivolous crap, and you are left with nothing. So keep your money yours and their money theirs, and that will go a long way to creating a boundary with other, like, marital resources that we see by the 8th house. You may also need to learn to put boundaries in place with Saturn retrograde in the 8th around sex and sexual activity, because it can be a signal that partners, committed partners, can ask you to do stuff you don't want to do, and you have no boundaries. You don't know how to say no, so you allow yourself to do things in the bedroom that are abhorrent to you really deep down. So you need to really work on honoring yourself with Saturn retrograde in the 8th and not allowing that to happen, and having boundaries in the bedroom in sex. Saturn retrograde in the 9th, it's an indicator that people who with Saturn retrograde in the 9th have been raised in a very strict religious type environment. They often have religion just, you know, forced upon them. They can't escape. Like, maybe they're sent to some strict religious school or something, or they're only allowed to associate, you know, with a certain church group, or they're sort of a bit culty, you know, their upbringing, their environment. And, you know, they're so immersed in religious dogma that they lose sight of who they really are, what their passions are, what their delights are, what their joys are, because what comes with religious dogma is, you know, instruction about this is what is the right thing to do, and this is what will make you happy, and what you actually do love to do and what actually does make you happy, it doesn't matter. The dogma is more important. That's one of the, don't get me started on religion. Let's not go there. But this is, when you've got Saturn retrograde in the 9th, this is one of the issues. And there, of course, is then trouble putting up boundaries and saying, you know what? No, I'm not going to align to this ridiculous belief system that says playing drums in a church environment is evil. You know, that's BS. And, you know, they have trouble. Saturn retrograde in the 9th house, people have trouble, you know, differentiating what is dogma and what is spirituality. And so they need to work on that. They need to, develop that muscle within them, and then they can express appropriately the boundaries that need putting in place regarding people who are trying to shove religious dogma down their throat. Let's leave that one aside, or else I'm going to jump on my I'm going to jump on my anti-religious bandwagon in a minute. Saturn retrograde in the 10th, it's a bit like the 6th house. It can bring problems with the workplace and with bosses. There's just no boundaries with bosses. You know, bosses take advantage of you. They don't respect you. They, you know, because you keep giving in when you've got Saturn retrograde in the 10th house. You keep allowing, you know, yourself to be taken advantage of, and you keep allowing the bosses to keep loading up the projects till you're absolutely overwhelmed because you don't have the capacity to say no to people in authority, to put boundaries in place regarding people in authority. And this can be with governments, this can be with, like I said, bosses, or anybody who is in an authoritative position over you in life. There is problems with saying no and having appropriate boundaries. Saturn in the retrograde in the 11th, it gives difficulty fitting in with your friendship groups. You know, there's a blockage there. There's a restriction there. We can, when we have Saturn retrograde in the 11th house, put our own self-imposed restrictions on ourselves and our ability to connect with friendship groups. So we can sort of be that really shy, when we've got Saturn retrograde in the 11th, but that really shy one at school who just doesn't reach out and connect with our peers, with our associates, with the people who are our own age, and we stand off to the side, and we just are afraid. We have our own self-limiting beliefs that come into play about connecting with others in a friendship sense, or with people who are our peers in the world. So that is something that needs that anxiety needs to be overcome in order to be able to then step out and integrate yourself with people who are, you know, your same age, your same friendship circles, your same interest groups. You know, there's a fear about connection with those people that needs to be overcome with Saturn retrograde in the 11th. And finally, Saturn retrograde in the 12th house. There's a lot of fears connected with abandonment. 12th house is sort of being isolated, being banished, being restricted. So Saturn retrograde can tend to isolate themselves and restrict themselves. You know, they can appear to be antisocial, but really what's going on here is that they're putting limitations on themselves when Saturn's retrograde in the 12th house, limitations on themselves, and keeping themselves stuck in isolation instead of allowing themselves to connect with others. This is just one of the challenges. Like I described a moment ago, 12th house energy is very similar to the energy of Saturn retrograde, and so there's double whammy challenge when you've got Saturn retrograde in the 12th house of, you know, too much Pisces negative energy, not necessarily channeling the higher levels of that Piscean 12th house Neptune energy, which is creativity, spirituality. You know, if you were channeling the higher levels, you would be expressing creativity, you would be having escapist times that are healthy and make you happy and enhance your life. You know, going to the movies, or having a day-to-day spa. These are healthy Piscean escapist activities. You would express these easily if you know, if your 12th house was healthy. But with Saturn here retrograde, you can't connect to your sense of divine creativity. You can't connect to your sense of spirituality. You have trouble, you know, you trouble with that sort of, you just over isolate yourself so unnecessarily and unhelpfully that your soul actually suffers. So you need to work on these things. You need to work on disconnecting in healthy ways rather than, you know, going down the drugs and the alcohol road. So learn to escape in ways and isolate yourself, because it is healthy to do so from time to time, to escape and isolate yourself in ways that are good, like, you know, going to a movie and going to a, you know, live at an ashram for a month or so. In fact, if you are a Saturn retrograde person in the 12th house, you might actually benefit a great deal from going and living in a form of a place of isolation for a period of time, like a month in an ashram or something, where you can actually learn to master the art of healthy retreat, healthy escape, you know. So, you know, it's going to take work to overcome that and do these things in healthy ways. So that's what we see when Saturn, this is just a brief overview of Saturn retrograde in each house. You know, there's blockage, there is restriction, there's limitations that we put on ourselves that internally and create anxiousness and fear for us that can hold us back. But the secret is, like I said, to do some inner work, face those fears, face those tendencies within us towards blockage and fear and anxiety and so forth, and then master that. It takes some hard work, but it can be done. Master that and start to express it in healthy ways out in the manifested reality. So that, I hope, helps clear up a bit of the energy of Saturn retrograde in the chart, what it means and what it might mean for you if you have Saturn retrograde in your natal chart. Stay tuned to Guiding Star, subscribe if you haven't already, and watch out for my upcoming series that I'm preparing for Saturn through each of the houses of the chart. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next week.